Okay, we'll turn to Psalm 77. Psalm 77. The inscription of this psalm is to the chief musician, to Jeduthun, a psalm of Asaph. 55 of the psalms are said to be to the chief musician. In this case, Jeduthun. That name also appears in Psalm 39 and Psalm 62. And from 1 Chronicles chapter 16 and 25, we see that he was one of the musicians appointed by David. We're told here that Asaph is the author of the psalm. There are 12 psalms said to be authored by Asaph. Psalm 50, and then Psalm 73 through Psalm 83. From 1 Chronicles 6, verses 31 and 32, there were a number of Levites that King David assigned to be leaders in song for the worship services of the tabernacle. And one of these men, 1 Chronicles 6, verse 39, was Asaph. And we learn from 2 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 30, that Asaph was a seer or a prophet, a preacher. So looking at this psalm, like most of the psalms, it pretty much outlines itself. The psalm can be divided into two parts. In verses 1 through 9, you see the distress and doubt of the psalmist, Asaph. And then in verses 10 through 20, you see the psalmist remembers God's works, and he finds hope and assurance in God and in the works of the Lord. So it is a psalm both of lament, verses 1 through 9, and a psalm of praise, verses 10 through 20. So in the psalm, Asaph moves from hopelessness and despair to encouragement and healing. The first part of the psalm, verses 1 through 9, completely different character. It's almost like two different psalms. Completely different character from the remaining portion of the psalm. When you reach verse 10, that is the turning point in the psalm. In verse 10, he says, "This is my infirmity." This is my infirmity. Referring to his present state, which he just described in verses 1 through 9, which we'll look at, and his distressful reaction to his present state. So he said, this is my infirmity. Then comes but. And this would be the transition point in the psalm. This is where everything changes. The entire tone of the psalm changes. It's still Asaph looking at his situation, but he's looking at it through a different lens, and everything changes. So he's brought from despair to encouragement. So you put the two divisions side by side. Verses 1 through 9, the other being verses 10 through 20. Verses 1 through 9, you have a man in agony. The other portion of the psalm, a man in great relief. Verses 1 through 9, you see a man who has basically lost his hold upon God. Lost his focus upon God. Second part of the psalm, you see a man that's with God. Same man, same circumstances. First part of the psalm, you see a man in desperate need of comfort and healing of mind. Second part of the psalm, you see a man that's transformed and encouraged. Again, same individual, same circumstances. First part of the psalm, you see a man of negative expressions. Second part of the psalm, a man of positive expressions. First part of the psalm, verses 1 through 9, Asaph is moving in a descending direction. And in the second part, he of course is moving in an ascending direction. So putting the two divisions side by side, two entirely different thought patterns, two entirely different perspectives, two entirely different moods. Though they are the same man, in the same circumstances, everything's different. So the psalm highlights a journey from distress and questioning God to finding hope and assurance. So let's look briefly at the first section. You see there Asaph feeling distress and doubt. His doubt comes from his distress and vice versa. But the psalm begins with, I cried unto God with my voice. For emphasis, he says, even unto God with my voice. The idea here is that this was very demonstrative. It was very earnest. It was a fervent cry. He says, I cried unto God with my voice. And this was something more than just words. Asaph says, and he gave ear unto me. That is, I know he heard me. I cried unto God with my voice. And I know he heard me. In verse 2, in the day of my trouble, inward unrest, an inward disturbance, a condition of distress and agitation, that which is bothersome and very stressful. He said, I cried unto the Lord in the day of my trouble. He goes on to say, I sought the Lord. And that, I believe, explains what he was doing when he cried unto the Lord. He was seeking God. He said, well, it's all good things. And it is. Verse 2 also, my sore, referencing the trouble that he was feeling, ran in the night and ceased not. That is, though I cried unto God, and I know he heard me, my trouble went through the day, through the night, continually upon me. There was no escape from it. And this in spite of crying unto God and God hearing him. He also says in verse 2, my soul, speaking of the depth of his trouble, refused to be comforted. So there's a problem with him. My soul refused to be comforted. He declined God's comfort. And there was no easing of his trouble. There was no quieting of his spirit. He says in verse 3, I remembered God. But his memory of God was flawed, because he says, I remembered God and was troubled. That is, I continued to be troubled. So I cried unto God. God heard me. I sought the Lord. I remembered God. And I'm still troubled. I continued to be troubled. Then he says, I complained, and my spirit was overwhelmed. I complained, and my spirit was overwhelmed. That is, as a result of his complaining, that is, I cried unto God, God heard me, I sought God, and nothing's changed. So I complained. And my spirit was overwhelmed, covered with grief and sorrow. So he's even in a worse condition now. He's pressed down, ready to sink. So again, the situation is, he cried unto God. He knows that God has heard him. And the more that he thinks upon that, the more troubled he becomes, and he's stuck, and he's seeking deeper into gloom. In verse 4, he says, Thou, God, holdest mine eyes waking. That is, he's experiencing sleepless nights. And he feels as if it's God who's holding his eyes open. And he says, I'm so troubled that I cannot speak. I'm so agitated. I am so perplexed that it feels like I can't even speak. So he has become sullen, if you will. In verses 5 and 6, he says, I have considered the days of old, the years of ancient times. I call to remembrance my song in the night. So he begins to remember better days. And he's starting to dwell on that. I commune with mine own heart, and my spirit made diligent search. So he ponders, he remembers, he recalls earlier days, better times, yet this didn't bring him any relief either. And he continues to be restless, continues to be sleepless, tossing, turning, searching for comfort. He says, I commune with mine own heart. That is, I talk to myself. And my spirit made diligent search. He's trying to figure things out. I've prayed. God's heard me. Yet nothing's changed. In fact, matters have gotten worse. Why? Why is this? And there he is, now in a state of depression. And questions begin to form in his mind. He says in verse 7, will the Lord cast off forever? So he's made the assumption now that the Lord's cast him off. Will he be favorable no more? Has His grace run out? Is His mercy clean gone forever? Doth His promise fail forevermore? Hath God forgotten to be gracious? None of these questions are helping. Hath He in anger shut up His tender mercies? Selah. That is, think on that. And that's what he's thinking upon. He's beginning to make assumptions about God. And he's beginning to question the Lord. He's in a terrible state of mind. Then the focus changes. Verse 10, this is where the psalm pivots. And I said, this. That's a word denoting something very specific. This is my infirmity. The word this, again, very important word there, has reference to something very specific. And in this case, it's referring back to his questioning of God's faithfulness. Verses 7 through verse 9. This is my infirmity. That is, my questioning of God, God's faithfulness. This is my infirmity. It's a carnal mindset. Again, he cried unto God. He knows God heard him. He sought God. Nothing's changed. And he's entered into a carnal mindset. It is a mindset of unbelief. It is a mindset of frustration. Unbelief leads to frustration. And frustration leads to more frustration or distress. He says, this is my infirmity. This is my disorder. This is my disease. This is my frailty. It is a disorder, in this case, a disorder, a disease, a frailty of mind. This is my infirmity. And it's the infirmity of us all. We've all done that. We pray. We expect instant relief. And when that doesn't happen, we begin to question. Begin to question God. This is my infirmity. Then you come to that next very important word. But. But. That is, in spite of that, he says, I will. But I will. And you'll notice in verses 10 through 12, 4 times, he says, I will. This is personal resolve. I have this infirmity of mind, but I will. I will. I will. I will. That's his desire. It is a desire to do what? To rise above his infirmity. He recognizes, I have a problem. My mind is not right. And as soon as we begin to question God, our mind's not right. As soon as we begin to make those assumptions, our mind's not right. Asaph realizes that. He has a desire to rise above his thought process. We all get in thought process traps. And you need to get out of it. You need to have a desire to rise above those negative thought processes. You can get stuck there for the rest of your life. I've known people been stuck in a negative process their entire life. They started to say they can't get out of it. They won't. They absolutely refuse to get out of it. But he has a desire to rise above. 4 times I will. And all 4 times it's in relation to the Lord. That's important. So he says, I will remember. It is, I'm going to strive to keep something in my mind. And what he strives to keep in his mind is the years of the right hand of the Most High. I'm going to strive to keep in my mind, the days of his abundant grace and mercy and love. I'm not going to forget that. He goes on, he says, I will remember, verse 11. Again, to keep something in mind, the works of the Lord. And then, surely, I will remember thy wonders of old, thy marvelous doings, miraculous doings. So 3 times he says, I will remember. Because that's where his problem is. His problem is in his mind. That's where most of our problems are. I will remember. Again, in relation to the Lord. It's an adjustment of mindset. It's an adjustment of mindset. You tell people this, you need to change your mindset. Well, I have a right to think this way. Go ahead then. Your life's going to be miserable. Your life's going to be miserable. There has to be an adjustment. And Asaph realizes that. In the first part of the psalm, the mind of Asaph is distracted. His mind is clouded. His mind is working against him. Our minds often work against us. And what that did was increase his troubles, causing him to even refuse God's comfort and causing him sleepless nights and filling him with doubt. So his mind is working against his own good. And how often that is the case. This is an infirmity. When our mind works against us, when our mind works against spirituality, that's an infirmity. It's an infirmity we're all subject to. But he's resolved for his mind to be right. So he says, I will remember. That is, I will keep in my mind his grace, his mercy, his love. I will keep in my mind his wondrous works. And then he goes on to say in verse 12, he takes it a step further. He says, I will meditate also. In addition to remembering, I will meditate also on all thy work. To meditate is to ponder. It's to carefully consider. It's to mull over and over and over. We know what it is to mull over and over and over something somebody said or didn't say, or something somebody did or didn't do. Which need to mull over and over and over is the Lord. His grace, His mercy. And that's what Asaph has come to realize. So this is a step beyond just remembering. It's occupying the mind with God. It's God's influence upon the mind. Again, in the first part of the psalm, his mind was wrongfully occupied. And he said, this is my infirmity. But now there's a shift. in the activity of his mind. And notice the result of this. He said, I'll talk of thy doings. There's a shift in his mind. There's a shift in his activity as well. I will remember. I will meditate. I will talk. And again, what is in the mind will determine the activity of the mind, which in turn will determine the activity of life. Coming to verse 10, Asaph sees God as the Most High. He's more than all. He's more than my infirmity. He overshadows all. And Asaph, upon thinking of God as the Most High, comes to this conclusion. Verse 13, he says, who is so great a God as our God? Asaph, with his mind focused upon God, then begins to speak of God's activities. Verse 14, thou art the God that doest. So his mind's on the activities of God. And then he mentions his wonders, his strength. Verse 15, he says, thou hast with thine arm, or his power, redeemed thy people. In verse 17, the voice of thine arrows went. Verse 18, thy thunder was in the heavens. Verse 20, thou leddest. So he's concentrating on the activities of God. You may not see God's activities right now in the present. That was Asaph in the first 9 verses. And when that happens, what do you need to do? You need to think back on those activities, when you could see God's activities. Asaph is focused upon God's provision of himself. Thou, thou, thou. He speaks of what God has done. He goes on, he says, thy way, thy path, thy footsteps. Thy way, thy path, thy footsteps. And he says, are not known. He comes to another realization. It simply means that God's movement and works are not always known. Don't assume he's not doing anything. If that were the case, you wouldn't be here. But that's what we assume so many times. God hasn't answered this prayer immediately. He's not doing anything. Just remember, his way, his path, his footsteps, not always known. Doesn't mean they're not there. They're always there. So, again, thy way, thy path, thy footsteps. It speaks of God's workings, and it cannot be overcome. Notice that his way, his path, his footsteps are in the sea. Reference to the Red Sea. And in the great waters. So we need to know God has a way. God has a path in such times and in such places. And there are his footsteps. This is always so. Whether you see them or not, they're there. You need to look for them. You need to always be looking for his way, his path, his footsteps in whatever the circumstance. It's God's direction. His way, his path, his footsteps, that speaks of the direction of God. It's God's provision of himself. Speaks of our responsibility to look for these things. Well, I did, and I still don't see them. Look again. Well, I did. Keep looking. Keep looking. They're there. They're there. Keep looking. Those very words, thy way, thy path, thy footsteps, speak of our responsibility to look for them. Speak of our responsibility to walk in them. Regardless of the situation, our concern should be what is His way, His path, His footsteps. As we've said many times, the situation and the circumstance is not the main concern. That's one of our infirmities as well. It's not the main concern. Our main concern is His way, His path, His footsteps in the circumstance. So it's in His way, His path, His footsteps. That's where we find nearness to God. That's where we find fellowship with God. As we all know, in life there are obstacles, there are hurdles, there are barriers, there are challenges, there's problems, and we have a mind that so often works against us. And we need to be looking, we need to know, first of all, whether we see it or not, He has His way, His path, His footsteps. And if you can't see it, you just trust it, because it's there, always. And we need to look for Him. There may be a time when God isn't pleased to show it to you. That's what's called faith. You just trust. I know it's there, so I just trust. That's better than making an assumption, well, God's not doing anything. God's always doing something. So look for them. Look for His way, His path, His footsteps. Walk in them. Be found in them. Trust in them. So we see in this 77th Psalm how quickly we can change. It works the other way as well. You can be having a great time spiritually, and all of a sudden your mind remembers something it shouldn't remember, and there you go. It can happen in an instant. It's true either way. So thank the Lord. Let's look to God in a word of prayer. Heavenly